where does the power of government actually come from? I mean, is it some ancient right passed down,
Mm.
or is it something else? Something starting with, well, us.
Right. And why does someone trying to get absolute power over you basically declare war, treating you like a beast of prey, as Locke puts it?
Exactly. These aren't just, dusty old questions. They're fundamental, still shaping things today.
Absolutely. They hit at the core of what makes government legitimate.
And that's what we're diving into today. We're using a source that really turned political thought on its head. John Locke's second treatise of government came out in 1690.
And it wasn't just theory, was it? He was pushing back against guys like Filmer, who talk about the divine right of kings going back to Adam.
Yeah, Locke was arguing for something different, justifying rule based on, well, the consent of the people.
A really influential text, then and now.
Totally. So our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack the big arguments in the second treatise. We'll look at his idea of life without government.
The famous state of nature.
Right. And then why people would leave that state.
Yeah.
What makes a government legit, according to Locke?
And maybe most crucially, what happens when that legitimacy breaks down?
Think of this as your guide, really, through ideas like natural rights, limited government, stuff that's foundational. By the end, you'll get why Locke is still so relevant.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Okay, so Locke basically dismisses that whole idea of power tracing back to Adam. Says it's impossible to track. So he says we need another rise of government.
Right. He clears the decks and asks, okay, what are humans like before government? What's the baseline?
Which is his state of nature.
Exactly. And he describes it using two key terms, perfect freedom and equality.
Perfect freedom. Does that mean just, total chaos? Do whatever you want?
Good question. No, and this is really critical for Locke. It's not a state of license.
Okay.
You have liberty over yourself, your actions, your stuff, but you're not free to just destroy yourself or harm other people.
So what stops you? If there's no government, no police.
Locke says it's governed by the law of nature. And this law is reason.
Reason?
Yeah, reason tells us, because we're all equal and independent, that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions.
So it's a moral code based on our shared equality that we can figure out through reason. That quote from Hooker fits here, right? About equality leading to love and justice.
Precisely. Our shared status under, well, God in Locke's view, means we have obligations to each other even without a government telling us so.
Okay, but if this law exists, who enforces it? That's the government's job now.
And that's the defining thing about the state of nature. Locke says the execution of the law of nature is put into every man's hands.
Every man's hands. Everyone gets to punish. That sounds potentially messy.
Well, it's not meant to be wild revenge. He says punishment has to be guided by calm, reason, and conscience. It should be proportional.
Proportional?
Yeah, enough for reparation and restraint to fix the damage and stop it happening again.
So if someone steals from me, I can punish them to deter them, and maybe others too.
Yes. And he makes this interesting distinction. There's the right, everyone has to punish the crime itself for deterrence, for preserving humanity.
Okay.
But then there's the separate right of the injured person to seek reparation, to get compensation for the harm done just to them.
Right. So say a murderer, anyone can punish them, even kill them, to deter others because they've become like a beast of prey.
Exactly. They've stepped outside the bounds of reason. But the victim's family, perhaps, has the specific right to seek reparation.
And even for smaller things, punishment should make the crime an ill bargain, not worth it.
That's the idea.
But still, this system, everyone is judge, jury, and executioner in their own case. Locke must see the problem there. It feels unstable.
Oh, absolutely. He knows people will say this sounds like confusion and disorder, and he agrees the inconveniences are huge.
That's the main inconvenience.
The big one is that men are judges in their own cases. We're biased towards ourselves, towards our friends, and when we punish others, passion and revenge can take over. We go too far.
So the state of nature isn't automatically Hobbes' war of all against all, but the enforcement is flawed. No impartial judge.
Exactly. It lacks, as he puts it, established, settled, known law, a known and indifferent judge, and the power to actually enforce judgments fairly.
Okay, that tracks. These inconveniences, this insecurity, that must be why people want to leave this state, which leads to the big one. Why create government?
That's the core argument. The problems, the inconveniences, make civil government the proper remedy.
And he doesn't just compare it to civil government generally. He draws this really sharp contrast. with absolute monarchy.
Yeah, this is crucial. He says, look, the state of nature has problems, sure, biased judges, but at least there, if someone judges wrongly, they're answerable to others.
Right.
Under an absolute monarch, the ruler is the law. There's no common judge between you and the king. If the king wrongs you, tough luck. You can't question it.
That's the polecats or foxes versus the lions line, isn't it? Preferring to maybe be devoured by the lion, the monarch, rather than deal with smaller threats?
That's the one. An absolute monarch in relation to their subjects is still basically in a state of nature because there's no higher appeal on earth.
And that lack of a common judge, that ties into his idea of the state of war.
Yes, which he defines very specifically. It's not just any fight.
What is it then?
It's force without right. Someone using unlawful force against another.
So trying to enslave me or steal my stuff by force, that puts the attacker in a state of war with me.
That's exactly it. Trying to get someone into your absolute power is like declaring war on them and on their life. That's why you can resist, even kill someone trying to do that. They've abandoned reason, become like that beast of prey.
And in civil society, the state of war stops when you can appeal to a judge. But where there's no judge, like under an absolute monarch, it can continue.
Correct. Which also connects to how he views slavery.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, historically. What's his take on legitimate slavery?
He argues the only legitimate kind, what he calls perfect slavery, is the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive.
So only if someone justly forfeits their life, maybe by starting an unjust war, and the victor in that just war chooses to enslave them instead of killing them.
Right. But even then, the enslaved person can resist if the hardship is worse than death. And here's a huge point. You cannot consent to be a slave.
Why not?
Because you don't have arbitrary power over your own life. You can't justly kill yourself, so you can't give that power over your life to someone else. Any agreement has to be limited, not absolute arbitrary power.
Okay, so state of nature, insecure, absolute monarchy, dangerous, basically a state of war waiting to happen. State of war is force without right. Slavery by consent is impossible. All this pushes people towards something else. What's the main driver, the big reason people unite?
Locke's very clear on this. The great and chief end of people forming commonwealths is the preservation of their property.
And we need to remember his definition of property here is broad, right?
Yeah, very broad. It's life, liberty, and estate. Your person, your freedom, and your material possessions. In the state of nature, enjoying all that is very uncertain, always under threat.
Because of those inconveniences, no set laws, no fair judge, no reliable enforcement.
Exactly. So people are willing, even eager, to leave that state full of fears and continual dangers and join a society where their property, in this broad sense, is safe.
Okay, but before society protects property, how do people even get material property? If the world was given to everyone in common, how does something become mine?
Ah, the labor theory of property.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. He says, okay, the earth is common, but every man has a property in his own person. Your body, your effort, that's yours.
My labor belongs to me.
Yes. And here's the breakthrough. When you mix your labor, which is yours, with something from nature's common stock, you make it yours. Your effort removes it from the common state.
Like picking up acorns under a tree or catching fish. My work makes them mine.
That's the idea. Ownership comes from individual effort, not just from a king granting it, but he did see limits initially.
Limits.
In the state of nature, you could only take as much as you could use before it spoiled, and you had to leave enough and as good for others.
But then money came along.
Right. Money changed the game. People agreed to value durable things like gold and silver, a little piece of yellow metal that doesn't spoil.
So you could sell your surplus apples for cash.
Exactly. You could accumulate wealth beyond what you could personally use without violating the spoilage rule. And this justified owning more land because you could cultivate it, sell the extra produce for money, and nothing went to waste.
And he argued that working the land, enclosing it, actually increased its value, benefiting everyone by making it more productive than just leaving it common.
Yes, labor creates most of the value. The earth gives raw materials, but our work transforms them.
Okay, so property life, liberty, estate is acquired through labor, exists in the state of nature, but it's insecure. The desire to secure that property drives people to unite.
Precisely. They trade the risky freedom of the state of nature for the security of established standing laws, indifferent and upright judges, and the collective force of the community to enforce those laws.
And how do they actually form this political society? What gives it authority over individuals?
Locke is absolutely firm on this. The only legitimate way is through consent, your own consent.
Not divine right, not conquest. Agreement.
Yes, people voluntarily agree to unite into a community for safety, peace, secure enjoyment of their property, and better protection against outsiders.
That's the fundamental shift. Power flows up from the people's agreement, not down from God or a monarch.
A complete inversion. The people are the source. Okay, so they consent to form a society. How does this new society make decisions?
Well, it can't require everyone to agree on everything, right? Nothing would ever get done.
Impossible. So Locke argues once you've consented to form one community, the majority has the right to act for the whole group.
Majority rule. It's necessary for the society to function as a single body.
Otherwise, it just dissolves immediately.
But hang on, someone listening might think, I never signed anything. I was just born here. How does Locke handle that? The fact that we don't really see societies starting with everyone explicitly signing up.
He addresses that. He points to some historical examples, maybe shaky ones, but his main point is the difference between express and tacit consent.
Express consent is clear, taking an oath, formally joining. That makes you a perfect member.
Right, but tacit consent, that's implied. Locke argues that just by living under a government, owning property there, enjoying its protection, you are implicitly consenting to its laws.
So, inheriting land, using the roads, being protected by the police, that's tacit consent.
Essentially, yes. Enjoying the benefits implies acceptance of the obligations while you're enjoying them. It binds you to obey the laws.
But it's not quite the same as express consent.
No, tacit consent doesn't necessarily make you a permanent member in the same way. If the government dissolves or you leave and sell your property, that obligation might end. Only express consent makes you that perfect member, fully integrated.
Got it. So government, founded on consent, express or tacit, aims to protect property, life, liberty, estate, operates by majority rule. What does this government actually look like? What are its parts? And crucially, its limits.
Okay, Locke says the supreme power in the Commonwealth is the legislative.
The lawmaking body.
Exactly, because that's the power the people collectively agreed to establish representing their united will.
It embodies that power they gave up from the state of nature, the power to judge and punish, now pooled under common rules.
Precisely. All other government powers have to be subordinate to it.
But this feels like a huge, but this supreme legislative power, it's not all-powerful, is it?
Absolutely not. This is central to Locke. It cannot be absolute or arbitrary.
Why not? Where does that limit come from?
It comes directly from the state of nature. Remember, no individual had absolute arbitrary power over their own life or anyone else's. You couldn't just kill or enslave someone legitimately.
Because you can't give away a power you never had in the first place.
Exactly. So the people couldn't give absolute arbitrary power to the legislative. Its power is limited to the public good. It cannot have the right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects.
The law of nature still applies, even to the government.
It absolutely does. The government can't violate those fundamental rights to life, liberty, and property.
Okay, so limit number 1. Act only for the public good. Respect natural rights. What else?
It must rule by declared and received laws, not by sudden, arbitrary decrees. People need to know what the rules are. This ensures stability and protects property.
Predictability.
Okay.
Makes sense. And the big one for property.
It cannot take anyone's property without their consent.
Consent. That's huge, especially for taxes.
Fundamental. Since taxes are a taking of property, they require the consent of the people, given either by themselves or through representatives they've chosen.
Taking property without that consent just blows up the whole reason for government, right? It's an invasion of the basic law of property.
Yeah. It subverts the entire end of government. As he asks, what good is property if someone else can just take it whenever they feel like it?
Right. So legislative, supreme, but limited by public good, natural law, known laws, and crucially, consent for taking property. Are there other parts to this government?
Yes, he talks about the executive power.
Which is?
The power to enforce the laws made by the legislative, to carry them out day to day.
And why keep that separate from making the laws?
2 main reasons. Laws need ongoing enforcement, but the legislative might not need to be constantly in session. More importantly, putting lawmaking and law enforcing power in the same hands. Well, that's too great a temptation to human frailty, a recipe for abuse.
Right, check and balance, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's the federative power.
Federate, what's that?
That's the power that deals with everything outside the Commonwealth. Foreign relations, war, peace, alliances, treaties. managing the community's security internationally.
Okay,
Right.
like foreign policy.
Exactly. He notes this power often requires more discretion, more judgment calls, because international situations are unpredictable. It's less easily managed by fixed laws than the internal executive power.
And he says the executive and federative are often held by the same people.
As often, yes. It's practical because both usually need to wield the force of the community. But the legislative remains supreme over both, even if it's not always sitting.
And even the executive's power to, say, call the legislature into session isn't about being superior, is it?
No, that's just a practical necessity, a trust given to the executive for the people's safe day and the smooth running of government, not a right to control the lawmakers.
This idea of trust keeps coming up. It seems central. Which brings us to prerogative.
Right, prerogative.
The idea that sometimes the executive needs to act quickly for the public good, even if there isn't a specific law covering the situation, or maybe even against a law in an emergency.
That's it exactly. Prerogative is that power to act according to discretion for the public good without the prescription of the law, and sometimes even against it. Lawmakers just can't foresee every possibility.
But again, like everything else, it's not unlimited power, is it?
Definitely not. It's crucial to see prerogative as a trust from the people, not an inherent right of the ruler. It's defined as the power of doing public good without a rule.
For the public good. That's the key.
Always. He talks about how early governments, maybe simpler times, operated almost entirely on prerogative. Rulers acted like fathers with broad discretion.
But then abuses happened.
Yes. When rulers started using that discretion for their own benefit, not the people's, the people realized they needed to set clear limits, define things with express laws.
And when people limit prerogative with laws, Locke says they're not stealing a right from the ruler.
Not at all. They're just clarifying the boundaries of a power that was always supposed to be used for their benefit. No rational person agrees to be ruled for their own harm. The power was granted in trust.
So the test of legitimate prerogative is simple. Does it aim at the public good? If yes, it's fine. If it aims to harm the people, it's a breach of trust.
Exactly. Prerogative can never justify harming the people. That's fundamentally inconsistent with the trust placed in the ruler.
Okay, this concept of government as a trust, held for the people, accountable to the people, it sets the stage for Locke's most radical argument. What happens if that trust is broken?
The dissolution of government. And he's careful to distinguish between the end of the society itself and just the end of a particular government.
Society usually ends through foreign conquest, right? If you're conquered, the whole political entity is gone.
Correct. But the government can dissolve from within while the society, the people, remain. And the main way this happens internally, he says, is through the alteration of the legislative.
Changing the lawmaking body without the people's consent. Why is that the big one?
Because the legislative is the soul of the Commonwealth. It's the power the people explicitly created and consented to. If that gets fundamentally changed or overthrown from within, the government built on it collapses.
How could that happen?
Well, one major way is if the executive, the prince or leader, starts imposing their own arbitrary will instead of the laws made by the legitimate legislative.
Setting themselves up as the lawmaker.
Effectively, yes. Or if they prevent the legislative from meeting or acting freely, or if they mess with the election process without consent, changing who votes or how, these all undermine the legislative the people agreed to.
Also, handing the people over to a foreign power would do it. That's a total betrayal.
A complete betrayal of the purpose of government. And finally, if the executive just stops enforcing the laws altogether, if everything descends into anarchy because the government isn't functioning, it's dissolved.
Okay, so in all these scenarios, the ruler overriding laws, blocking the legislature, changing elections, selling out the country, or just total neglect the government dissolves because the rulers themselves broke it.
Mm-hmm.
So, who's the real rebel here?
And this is Locke's bombshell. He says, the rulers who do these things are the true rebels.
The rulers are the rebels.
Yes. By acting against the trust, breaking the Constitution, using force without right against the legislative or the people's property, they are the ones introducing a state of war. They are rebelling against the legitimate order the people established.
Oh, okay. So if the rulers are rebels, acting illegitimately, dissolving the government, what about the people?
The power reverts back to them. They return to their original state, free to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative. The society still exists, and it has the ultimate right to preserve itself by forming a new government.
Which means they have the right to resist the illegal force being used by those former rulers who are now acting without authority.
Exactly. It's self-defense against unlawful force. Resisting force without right is always justifiable. People have the right not just to escape tyranny, but to prevent it.
Okay, the obvious objection, which Locke knew well, is that this sounds like a recipe for chaos, a foundation for a rebellion constantly undermining stability.
He tackles that head on. First, he says, look, people are actually very conservative. They don't overthrow governments for minor mistakes. It takes a long train of abuses, a clear pattern showing a design towards tyranny before they'll actually resist.
So it's not a knee-jerk reaction, it's a last resort.
Definitely. Second, he turns the argument around. This doctrine doesn't cause rebellion. It helps prevent it by warning rulers what will happen if they abuse their power. It keeps them in check.
And he argues the real source of disorder isn't the people resisting, it's the ruler's insolence, and it tends to grab arbitrary power in the first place. Oppression breeds rebellion.
Precisely. Resisting an official using illegal force is no different, morally, than resisting a common thief or pirate. Force without law is just force. He even points out that thinkers who supported kings, like Berkeley, admitted people could resist a tyrant in extreme cases.
Right, though Locke then picks apart Berkeley's weird rules about how to resist, like you have to do it with reverence and can't actually punish the tyrant afterwards.
Yeah, Locke finds that illogical. You can't fight force with politeness. And a ruler who acts tyrannically against the trust essentially stops being a ruler. They forfeit their authority. Their crime is actually worse because of the trust they held.
As King James I supposedly said, a king rules by law for the people's good. A tyrant makes everything serve his own will. Where law ends, tyranny begins.
A very Lockean sentiment, ironically, from a king.
Okay, this leads to the ultimate question, maybe the toughest one. If the government is dissolved, if the rulers have broken the trust, who gets to judge that this has happened? Who decides?
Locke admits God is the ultimate judge, of course, but here on Earth, when there's no common judge left, the legislative is gone. The rulers are acting against the people, he says. Every man is judge for himself. Whether someone, even a prince, has put themselves into a state of war with him.
So it comes down to the individual conscience. But surely not just isolated individuals deciding randomly.
It seems to be more about the collective judgment of the body of the people. When the trust is so fundamentally broken, the people as a whole recognize that the basis of government is gone. They then have just cause to make that appeal to heaven.
The appeal to heaven.
Meaning, since there's no earthly judge left, they appeal to the ultimate judge, God, essentially asserting their natural right to self-preservation, which might involve force. It signifies the breakdown of the political order and the return to a state where force might be met with force. It's the people reclaiming the ultimate sovereignty they only delegated in trust.
Wow. Okay, that is quite a journey. We went from the state of nature with natural rights but insecure to people consenting to form government to protect property, life, liberty, estate.
Right, a government with a supreme legislative, but one that's strictly limited by the public good, known laws, and consent, especially on property.
With an executive holding power, including prerogative, only as a trust for the people.
And if that trust is broken, if the rulers become rebels and dissolve the government, the power returns to the people who have the right to resist and form a new government.
It's a powerful framework. You can really see how it fueled ideas about rights, revolution, constitutional limits on power.
Absolutely. It provided a strong philosophical basis for saying power comes from the people, government is accountable to the people, and there are lines rulers cannot cross.
It really did offer a potent alternative to the idea that power just flows down from above, unquestionable.
A foundation for so much modern political thought.
So, thinking about all this, here's something to chew on, maybe a provocative thought for you listening. Locke says, when government breaks down, when there's no earthly judge, the appeal is to heaven, and individuals judge if they have cause. In our modern world, with courts, elections, constitutions, what does that appeal to heaven even mean anymore? How would you know, using Locke's own ideas, if a government had so fundamentally broken its trust that such an extreme concept might even become relevant?
That's a tough one. It really forces you to think about where ultimate power lies and what the absolute limits are, even today.
Definitely something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Locke's second treatise.